This is our project for the day. It's a Honda EX800. I've never worked on one of these, but customer says it won't start, and I believe him, so let's check it out. Since it's an old generator and been sitting, I know the problem is probably in the fuel system, so I'm going to go ahead and clean out the fuel tank and look into the carburetor. So I have this little pump here that I use to take out all the fuel in the tank, and then I want to make sure the tank has a chance to dry. Make sure there's no water left in there. I don't see any rust on the inside of the tank, so that's good news. I'll want to make sure it's completely dried out before I put fuel back into it, but there we go, clean out the gas tank. So on the other side here is where you get to the carburetor and the air filter. There's a couple of Phillips head bolts. Looks like it's missing two. I'll put these right down in the gravel where they're nice, easy to find. That's a joke, by the way. Okay, so it looks like that's probably an 8mm. Yep, 10mm is too big. One thing you want to take note of is where this choke lever is at, because as you can see, this little doohickey here, which activates the choke, goes into this slot here on the choke lever, so be careful about that when you take it off, and when you reassemble, make sure it's in place. One thing about generators, I mean, you really want to be careful and make sure you do everything exactly right, because when you need them, you need them. You know what I mean? Okay, there we go. This is just a breather hose from the engine. It looks like the, well, I'll show you what this looks like, all these linkages and whatnot. It looks like everything's hooked up correctly. Got the spring and the rod that go to the carburetor throttle plate here. Let's go ahead and take off the fuel line, just so we can drain any remaining fuel out of the system that's in there. And you'll want to be careful not to harm this fuel line. One of the ways to get them off is to twist them like this, because they kind of get stuck on there. And then I pry them like this. There we go. See, there still was a little bit of gas in there. So it looks like now we can actually take this carburetor off. It's probably a good idea. That way we can look inside everything. And you can see these lines are just overflow lines off the carburetor. This is the line that you would drain your float bowl, and it would come out of that. But let's see, so to get this carburetor off, it looks like all we need to worry about is this linkage up here. You can see down here I'm going to have to move this line above that spring just so I can pull it out. There we go. And yeah, so it looks like I can just keep pulling this carburetor straight off, and then I'm going to have to rotate it this way, and it comes right off. You disconnect the linkage and the spring, and make sure your O-ring seal is still in place there. So let's take a look inside this carburetor. So you can see you have your O-ring on that side, and you have that gasket where your air filter goes. It's a 12mm bolt to take off the float bowl. It's pretty gooey there. Hope that's not a sign of what's on the inside. Well, you can see there's quite a bit of crud in there. Time to clean that out. And you can see some of the sediment here. Yeah, it's a lot. But this carburetor is definitely salvageable, cleanable. Basically, I'll use a toothbrush and scrapers and whatever else I need to clean this up. So let's go ahead and take out the float and the float valve. Don't lose anything. Oh, see the float valve? That's important. Don't lose it. You got your float pin, and your float valve. It's always a good idea to replace the float valve. You'll also want to be careful that the O-ring stays in place, or if it comes out when you take the carburetor apart, don't worry about it. Just make sure to reinstall it. But you can see there's just a lot of sediment inside the carburetor that needs to be cleaned out, especially up here. And you do need to remove the main jet, which is located down in that hole there. I don't know if you can see, but you need a real skinny screwdriver to get down in there. And sometimes these things can really be a pain to get out. So when the main jet comes out, we'll also have to remove the nozzle, which, if you can see it down in there, is that brass tube that pokes up. That's not the main jet. It's usually not part of the main jet. It's usually separate from the main jet, and you'll have to remove that too. Sometimes you have to stick a screwdriver in and push it downward to get it to pop out, especially if they're all corroded in place like this one probably is. And on the outside here, so your pilot jet system is underneath this silver bolt here, so we'll want to remove that and make sure that the pilot jet, or the slow jet, is nice and cleared out too, as well as the main jet, which goes in this hole. And this is the only screwdriver I have that will fit down in there. Long, skinny one. Just be careful because it is brass and you can strip it out very easily, so be very careful removing it. There we go. Got it loose. Like I say, if you strip that out, you might as well buy a new carburetor. You can see the main jet starting to pop up there. That's as far as it'll go. So you tip it upside down and you have to work it out sometimes. See, it's starting to come out now. There we go. That's how tiny that little sucker is. And I would almost guarantee that the hole is plugged up. Yep, looks like it's plugged to me. And so now we have to get out the nozzle. I don't think it's going to come out unless I stick something down in there and push down on it. Just want to be careful not to break anything. Pry up on it a little bit here. Oh, there it goes. Yep. So you can no longer see it poking up in there because it's starting to work its way out. So I'm going to use this pick to get down in that hole and hopefully poke it out. Well, that thing is really in there. So I have a different pick here. I'm going to try and go in, wiggle it around a little bit, break it loose. I sprayed a little bit of carburetor cleaner in there. Sometimes that can help. So I'm going to poke it back up into place, push it down again. Hopefully it'll work loose sooner or later. Dang, man, that sucked. Finally got this little out of here. That's what it looks like. And it goes up in the carburetor this way. Jeez. You can see there's a little bit of corrosion on it, and those are the holes that you want to make sure are clear. You have as well as all the way through, you want to make sure is clear. And let's see what we have under here. Sometimes you have to take out the idle adjustment screw or screw it in a bit to get this one out. Oops. And you won't be able to see it, but way down in that hole is a brass slow jet or a pilot jet. You'll need a very thin wire to poke down in there and clear that out. I'll show you. I'll spray a little bit of carburetor cleaner in there, try to help me out. Can you all see that brass jet down in there? That's what you need to poke out. You see the carburetor cleaner is still pooled up on it. I don't know if you can see that, but that's telling me that that hole is not cleared out. So I've been trying to use this wire to get down in there, but believe it or not, that wire is too big. So I'm going to try a smaller gauge wire. So what I do is I pull off a strand and try and poke it down in there, but believe it or not, that strand is too big. So I'm going with a smaller gauge wire. I live in a town where they ring the bell at noon. That's what that noise is. Those are the town bells signifying 12 o'clock p.m. noon. So it's not easy to poke this out because you know, you usually have to use pretty small, flimsy wire, but you'll know when you finally poke through. So this is as far as I had to take it apart. Got the float bowl bolt or plug. You've got the slow jet plug. This is your float hinge pin. This is your main jet. This is your nozzle, or they also call it an emulsion tube. And this is your float valve. This is one of the most important working parts inside the carburetor. You can see it has a rubber tip, and that rubber tip is what seals off the gas flow. When the float rises, it pushes this little rocket-shaped thing up into the hole. It's a good idea to replace these things anytime you're inside the carburetor. However, they don't always need to be replaced. If you see any groove in the rubber tip, then it's time to replace it. You have your float bowl O-ring. That's as far as you have to take your carburetor apart. And some of the important parts, the really important parts to address are, you want to make sure you're clean inside this, your main jet passage. And if you look down in there, you can see it's pretty clean. You also want to make sure that your float valve area is good and cleaned out. You can see now how clean the carburetor is. These are the tools I use to clean it out. You have to have some small wire like this, or even smaller, to poke through the pilot jet hole. But as you can see, carburetor is pretty clean now. And you'll want to address those areas. And of course, the pilot jet hole, or the slow speed jet hole, it's very, very tiny. This wire here was too big to poke it out. I had to get a smaller wire to get down into that brass jet. It's a good idea also to look inside your fuel inlet to make sure there's no corrosion in there. You have these two holes here. You'll want to blow some air through, make sure those passageways are clear. Another tricky spot inside these carburetors, tech tip number 3462. Inside this side of the carburetor, you will see tiny little holes. Can you see them? I think there's 3 total. This one here I usually don't bother cleaning out. It's where this screw comes out, and it usually doesn't get plugged. But these other two behind it, sometimes there's three, those are the ones that usually get plugged. Can you see them back there? Very small. I just use my wire. I just use my wire and I bend it 90 degrees to get down in there. And once again, you'll want to make sure these holes are cleared out. Go ahead and put this in. We'll go ahead and put this in this way. My main jet, I don't know if you can see it. You can see through it now. There you go. That's what you want. You also want to clean out inside this little bigger hole here so nothing else flakes off in there. Now, not too tight. I had to push that nozzle in place a little bit harder than I normally have to. I'm not sure what was going on there. But you don't want to tighten this up too much. That brass can strip out really easily. So I did decide to replace the float valve here with a float needle. This was the part number. Better put the old one over here so I don't get them mixed up. Oh! Just like that. Oh, that. Try this again. So we have the slow jet all cleaned out, so we can put this plug back in. Put the gasket back in place. Float bowl's nice and clean. A little bit of rust occurred overnight, but we'll be all right. Not too tight, but tight enough. That should do it. At this point, this carburetor is all cleaned up and ready to go back on. All right, let's see what we have here. So it looks like the spring and linkage both go through the same hole here. I'll put the spring in first. Linkage came out. And there we are. Looks like we're on. Make sure to route the overflow tubes back where they belong. I think this one went up here, didn't it? And it actually goes in behind there, behind that spring, and into this slot here, so it stays out of the way. Alright, so these hoses are out of the way of the governor spring here. Put the fuel line back on here. I hope this carburetor works now. Not too tight. I always say that. Tight enough. There we go. Alright, and remember when putting this back on, that little part goes on the choke here. Go. I have to get some more of these. There was only 2 of them. I'll put them both. I'll put them right here for now. Double check, make sure that the choke is engaging. Yep. I want to make sure this is completely dried out, and if there's any dirt in there, it'll come out. I think we're ready for gas. That should be enough. So choke on. Make sure that the engine switch is on. Let's see what we have here.